He stood there, hands bound, a gun pressed to his head, not by a criminal, but by the very officer sworn to protect the public. And when he quietly showed his FBI badge, the cop just laughed and spat. "I know your kind. That badge don't mean a damn thing." In that moment, under the cold lights of a subway platform, the truth hit harder than any bullet. Sometimes the real fight isn't just against the criminals we chase, but against the ignorance we carry within our own ranks. This isn't just a story about a mission gone wrong or a fugitive who got away. It's about pride, prejudice, and the deadly price of assuming guilt by the color of a man's skin. If this story moved you, I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. We've got more stories that reveal the truths many would rather ignore. It was 9:45 on a Friday night when the last train pulled into Lexington station, a crumbling stop beneath Providence, Rhode Island. The air underground was heavy, dense with the scent of wet concrete and old metal. Overhead lights flickered like a weak pulse struggling to stay alive, casting more shadows than clarity. The platform stretched long and narrow, its yellow safety line barely visible under grime, and the distant rumble of approaching trains came and went like a warning no one really heard. Most folks with sense had cleared out by then. This was the time of night when the city's pulse slowed, but its dangers sharpened. Lexington Station wasn't just a stop on the map. It was a crossroads, a place where desperate deals were struck in the shadows, where cash and contraband changed hands faster than ticket stubs. Beneath the city, the rules bent easily. And the last train, that was the cue. When it passed, whatever business remained had to wrap up before the lights cut out and the station truly belonged to the ghosts of Providence's underbelly. An old PA system crackled overhead, announcing the final departure to nowhere in particular. A teenage girl leaned against a cracked pillar, earphones in, hoodie up, eyes flicking nervously between faces. A man with a duffel bag paced slow circles, his boots scraping with the impatience of someone waiting for more than just a ride home. But it wasn't the passengers that made the air heavy tonight. Somewhere on the platform, a transaction was about to happen. A shipment, small but lethal, intended for hands that never should have held it. An arms deal orchestrated in the dark, shielded by the very filth of the station's walls. The dealer was said to be a ghost, Greg Santoro, ex-mercenary, known for making men disappear before their shadows could catch up. Watching from afar, blending in with the shadows, stood Elijah Barnes, a black man in his 40s, dressed like any other commuter. But there was a fire behind his steady gaze, the kind you only earn from years of hunting threats no one dared speak of. Above ground, rain slicked the streets of Providence, washing away footprints but not intentions. And down here, under the crumbling bones of the city, the air wasn't just thick with humidity, it was thick with a promise, one that someone tonight wouldn't live to keep. Among the shadows of Lexington Station, 4 lives were on a collision course, though only one of them knew it. Officer Kyle Redding and a 38-year-old cop with a chest like a barrel and a temper to match patrolled the platform with heavy boots and heavier suspicions. He wasn't on duty officially, just passing through after a drink at a nearby dive bar, but for men like Redding, the badge was more than a job. It was an excuse to watch, to question, to press. Kyle had grown up in Providence, but not in its heart. He carried a belief, ugly and unspoken, that the city's rot always had the same color. To him, a black man standing still in the wrong place was always a prelude to trouble. And if tonight was quiet, Redding would make his own noise. Down the platform, Elijah Barnes stood alone, shoulders relaxed, hoodie up, phone in hand. But every part of his presence was deliberate. At 40, Barnes had the disciplined stillness of a man who'd spent years in places where stillness kept you breathing. He'd served his time as a counterterrorism specialist overseas, Baghdad, Mogadishu, Kabul, names that stayed with you long after the sand left your boots. But here, beneath the city that raised him, the enemy was different, less organized, more reckless. Barnes wasn't just watching, he was listening. An earpiece nested discreetly in his right ear carried the calm voice of his partner. Special Agent Valeria Cruz, only 34 but sharp as a scalpel, monitored the station from the cramped surveillance room 2 stories up. She watched the grainy camera feeds, her eyes trained for patterns, for the telltale signs of a deal about to unfold. Cruz was born in El Paso, the daughter of a single mother who worked the border fence, and she learned early that vigilance was a form of survival. She'd earned her command not with volume, but with precision, and her voice through Barnes' earpiece reflected it. Target approaching, East Tunnel entrance, clock him, Elijah. The target, Greg Santoro, 45, built like a refrigerator, beard flecked with gray, moved with the swagger of a man who'd killed before and knew the weight of it. A former mercenary with blood on every continent, Santoro had reinvented himself in the States and as an arms broker to the worst kinds of men. Cartel lieutenants, rogue militias, even domestic extremists itching for civil war. He didn't rush. He never did. Deals like tonight's, quiet, efficient, deadly, were his art. On that cracked, dim platform, these four paths spiraled closer with every second. Redding's gaze had already landed on Barnes. He didn't know the name, didn't know the mission, but he knew the look, still focused, composed. And Redding, soaked in his own bias, thought he saw something else. Thinks he's smarter than the rest of us, Kyle muttered under his breath, hand resting on his duty weapon. In his mind, Barnes wasn't a man doing his job. He was a threat dressed like an ordinary commuter. And that, for Kyle Redding, was reason enough to act. Above, Valeria Cruz's voice crackled again in Elijah's ear. You've got a tail, Elijah. Stay cool. But below, Barnes already knew. He could feel it. And the night hadn't even begun to bleed yet. The air inside Lexington station was thick. Not just with damp and diesel, but with the kind of weight that made you check over your shoulder without knowing why. Elijah Barnes felt it, but he kept his pace even, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze aimless by design. He wore a plain black hoodie, jeans, and a pair of well-worn sneakers. Nothing flashy, nothing to attract a second glance. A single earbud rested in his left ear, tuned to the subtle murmur of Valeria Cruz monitoring from the surveillance room above. Santoro's down near track 4. He's moving slow, waiting on his buyer. Her voice hummed through the wire. Stay fluid, Elijah. Don't get close too fast. Barnes adjusted the volume on his phone, pretending to scroll through music. In reality, the screen was black. Its only purpose to mask his real work. He was listening for code words, subtle signals exchanged between Santoro and the buyer, a man they only knew by a partial name, Cobb. The Bureau had spent months closing the distance on this deal, a shipment of military-grade weapons bound for a domestic terror cell operating in rural Maine. If this transaction happened, dozens of innocent people could pay the price later. But even as he closed the gap, something tugged at the back of Barnes' neck, the feeling of eyes not from the target, but from somewhere else entirely. It wasn't Cruz, she would have called it. This was different, primal, weighty. Behind him, Officer Kyle Redding was clocking every move Barnes made. The hoodie, the headphone, the slow gait, it all added up to suspicion in Kyle's eyes. Never mind that this was a public place, that plenty of people dressed the same more at this hour. Kyle didn't see attire, he saw skin. Black male, late 30s or 40s, walking like he's got no business here, Kyle muttered to himself. Why is it always them? Kyle wasn't on the clock, but that didn't matter to him. The badge in his wallet gave him license in his mind to patrol wherever and whenever he wanted. And if Providence PD wouldn't do it officially, he'd handle it himself. He told no one, no radio call, no backup, just him, his gut, and the Glock holstered at his waist. Takes one to watch one, he whispered under his breath, easing his steps to keep Barnes in range, but not too close. Every time Elijah shifted his weight, Kyle's hand hovered near his belt. He was waiting, hoping for the wrong move. The sudden burst of speed, the awkward glance back, anything that would justify the confrontation forming in his mind. And yet, Barnes did none of that. He remained composed, head tilted slightly as if catching a favorite tune, his body language quiet but deliberate. Up in the surveillance room, Valeria Cruz watched the cameras with increasing tension. She saw Barnes on camera 7, Santoro lingering near the metal benches on camera 9. But she also caught the shadow trailing behind Elijah. The feed was grainy but unmistakable. Uniform pants, patrolman's boots. Elijah, she murmured, you've got a tail. White male, patrol gear. I don't think he's ours. Barnes didn't react outwardly, but his mind sharpened. He knew the game. You could always tell when someone was watching you, not because of noise, but because of focus. It was like a heat lamp on your back. And this wasn't a mugger or a pickpocket. This was a cop. Barnes could feel the rhythm, the way the steps matched his, the way the distance stayed just long enough for plausible deniability. "Copy," he replied softly, keeping pace. But Kyle wasn't keeping pace, he was closing in. In his mind, Kyle heard echoes, old lectures from the academy, locker room banter from fellow officers, the voice of his father telling him when he was a boy that you can spot trouble by how it walks. The color of Barnes' skin made the steps sound louder. The hoodie turned invisibility into threat. Every second, Kyle's certainty grew. This man was up to no good, and Kyle Redding was the only one paying attention. Barnes paused near a graffiti-stained column, pretending to check his phone, head slightly bowed. Kyle's blood pressure spiked. He thought, he's signaling, waiting for backup, maybe a drug drop, could be worse. But the only signal was Cruz's voice, firm and low in Barnes' ear. "Elijah, Santoro's getting antsy. If we lose him..." Before she could finish, Kyle's boots echoed louder, fast and sure. He was moving in. And Barnes knew it. He saw the reflection in a shattered glass panel beside the column, a bulky figure, hand at the belt, eyes locked in. "Shit," Barnes whispered under his breath. "Cruz, he's coming." "Don't escalate," she snapped. "You hear me? Stay still. Stay calm." But there was no stopping Kyle now. "Hey, you!" Kyle barked, voice slicing through the station like a blade. Barnes turned slowly, his expression blank, his eyes calm. Inside, his pulse kicked up, but his face was stone. "Evening, officer." "You think I don't know what this is?" Kyle sneered, stepping closer, hand fully on his holster now. "Hoodie, earbud, just standing around. You think I'm that stupid?" "I'm waiting for a train," Barnes replied evenly. "Just like everyone else." "Bullshit," Kyle spat. "What's in your pocket? Why you looking around? Why you scoping the platform?" Upstairs, Valeria Cruz slammed her hand on the desk. "Elijah, don't reach for anything," she ordered. "Let him search you. Do not give him an excuse." "Copy," Barnes breathed. He raised his hands slightly, palms out. "I'm just standing here, sir. My ID's in my back pocket. If you want it..." "Shut up. Don't tell me how to do my job." Kyle was inches from him now. The smell of cheap whiskey clung to his breath, the sweat beating at his temple. He'd waited for this, for that one opportunity to prove his instincts right, and nothing would derail it now. But as he reached forward, Barnes caught a glimpse, over Kyle's shoulder, of Greg Santoro slipping through the far end of the platform, a black duffel in hand, a shadow with intent, a killer vanishing into the dark while a badge, blind and belligerent, stood in the wire. Valeria's voice roared through Barnes' ear. "Santoro's moving! We're losing him!" But down here, there was no way past Kyle. Not without force, not without making the very headline he'd fought his whole life to avoid. Black man takes down cop in subway. The kind of story that didn't end with a trial, only a headline, only a body. Barnes stared straight into Kyle's eyes and knew, if I move wrong, I die here. And as that truth settled heavy in his bones, Kyle smiled, because in his mind, he was about to save the city from a threat that only he could see. Elijah Barnes had been still, eyes forward, playing the part of the idle commuter. His hand was close to his pocket recorder, catching every word traded between Greg Santoro and his buyer just a few yards away. The acoustics of the station distorted sounds, but years of fieldwork had taught Elijah how to filter the noise. The transaction was nearing the exchange point. Just a few more coded confirmations, and they'd have the evidence to take Santoro down for good. Then the shout tore through the air, louder than the screech of any oncoming train. "Hey, hands where I can see 'em now!" Before Elijah could turn, a hard shove slammed his chest against the damp concrete wall of the platform. His breath caught for a split second, ribs jarred from the sudden impact. Cold metal pressed into his temple, a gun barrel, pressed hard enough to remind him just how fast things could turn fatal. Officer Kyle Redding had closed the distance in a rush, rage bubbling just beneath the surface of his clipped commands. "What the hell you got in that pocket, huh? What's that device? Don't move." Elijah didn't flinch, didn't resist. His hands raised slowly, palms outward, his voice calm though his pulse thundered in his ears. Federal agent, FBI, my badge is in my back pocket. I'm on a federal op. Kyle barely heard a word. The title, the agency, it didn't matter. His mind was already made up. Federal agent, my ass. Kyle sneered, his voice laced with disdain. What's next? You gonna tell me you're undercover? Or is that just what the thugs call it now? Without waiting for permission, Kyle yanked Elijah's arm back, forcing his shoulder at a brutal angle. Elijah winced but stayed silent, knowing that a single spark, one wrong word, one sudden shift, could ignite this into something irreversible. Then came the line, the one that cut deeper than the gun, the flex cuffs, the bruises blooming beneath his hoodie. You think that cheap badge fools me? I know your kind. FBI, my goddamn ass. Kyle spat the words out, the phrase wrapped in that ugly, familiar venom. It wasn't about the badge, and both of them knew it. Above, in the surveillance room, Valeria Cruz was shouting into the comms. Kyle Redding, this is a federal operation. Do not engage. That's a federal agent you've got hands on. But her voice didn't penetrate the chaos below. Kyle had tunnel vision, the same kind that turned compliance into defiance, that transformed any movement into perceived threat. As Kyle jerked Elijah around to face him, the gun never left its target, Elijah's head. His thumb toyed near the safety, like a child itching to pull a trigger on a toy. Let me see it. The badge, where is it? Back pocket, Elijah repeated quietly. Take it out yourself, slow. But Kyle didn't move toward the pocket. Instead, his gaze scanned Elijah's chest, spotting the recording device clipped beneath the jacket. His eyes lit up, confirmation bias kicking in like jet fuel. What's this then, huh? Who the hell you recording down here? He ripped the device free with one hand, waving it like a trophy. His grin was ugly, triumphant. That's not bureau issues, son. That's a snitch's toy. So who you working for? You recording for some gang? Selling out the next dealer in line? The platform wasn't empty. A couple waiting at the far bench looked on, frozen. A teenager with a skateboard pulled out his phone, recording silently from behind a pillar. Every eye caught the image of a white officer pinning a black man, gun to his head, accusations flying without pause. And not far off, Greg Santoro noticed too. The shout, the raised weapon, the words exchanged. Santoro's head turned just enough to catch sight of the scene, and in that instant, a lifetime of battlefield instinct kicked in. That's heat, that's trouble. Without hesitation, Santoro closed the duffel bag, muttered something to his buyer, and peeled off toward the side tunnel, disappearing into the dark arteries of the station's underbelly. Upstairs, Valeria Cruz's voice snapped over comms. Elijah, Santoro's on the move, you've got to disengage. But the voice in Elijah's ear was cut short. Kyle had ripped the earpiece free and crushed it beneath his boot with a deliberate stomp. Enough with the damn talking. You're not FBI. You're a liar in a hoodie, and I'm done being lied to. Then, loud enough for the whole platform to hear, Kyle growled, I'm not letting some black bastard with a recorder roam my station without knowing what the hell he's doing here. There it was, out in the open. The thing that had really driven Kyle Redding's rage from the moment he saw Elijah standing still. Not the device, not the earbud, not the hoodie. His skin, his presence, his existence. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Every word would have been wasted on a man who'd already made up his mind before the first sentence was ever spoken. But Kyle wasn't finished. He yanked the flex cuffs from his belt and twisted Elijah's arms behind his back, locking them with a plastic zip tie so viciously tight that Elijah's hands numbed almost instantly. You're under suspicion of illegal surveillance, conspiracy to traffic, and resisting an officer's authority, Kyle spat, inventing charges with the kind of ease only a man with a badge and a bias could muster. Elijah's voice was low, controlled, though the cuffs bit into his wrists. You just let a gun trafficker walk out of here, right under your nose, and all you caught was your own ignorance. Kyle jammed the barrel harder against Elijah's back. Ignorance? The only thing ignorant is thinking you can play dress up as a Fed and pull one over on me. Somewhere in the background, the teenager's camera shook, still recording, capturing every word, every insult, every piece of venom Kyle Redding threw. But it was too late. The damage was done. Santoro was gone. The deal was blown. and Elijah Barnes, federal agent, counterterrorism specialist, was standing cuffed, disarmed, humiliated. Not by the enemy, not by the criminal they had hunted for months, but by the very system he'd sworn to defend. The system, in that moment, wore Kyle Redding's face. The platform, once filled with the dull thrum of idling trains and distant echoes, now felt heavy with silence, a suffocating, electric stillness broken only by the shallow breaths of a man whose mission had just crumbled beneath the weight of someone else's pride. Elijah Barnes stood motionless, wrists burning from the flex cuffs, the back of his head still aching from where Kyle Redding had shoved him into the wall. His mind should have been on the operation, on where Santoro was heading, on what the Bureau needed to do next. Instead, his thoughts circled the bitter truth. He'd been taken down by the very prejudice he'd spent his career trying to work above. And yet, Kyle stood behind him, still gripping the firearm like a judge and executioner, eyes scanning the platform with that same hollow certainty. "I'll call for backup," Kyle muttered to himself, not to Elijah. "Get someone down here to process this. Figure out what the hell you really are." Above them, Valeria Cruz was in motion, bolting from the surveillance room, barking orders into her comms. "We have an officer obstructing a federal op. Elijah Barnes is in custody, wrongfully. We need a team on Redding before he screws this up even further." But time, as it always did in moments like these, stretched painfully slow. Down on the platform, more phones were out now. Commuters who hadn't fled stood still, watching. Some whispered, others openly recorded. Witnesses collecting receipts for a confrontation that, but for Elijah's restraint, could have ended with a body on the floor. And yet Kyle kept talking, his voice drenched in years of pent-up disdain. "I've been on the force 15 years, he grumbled, "seen your type come through thinking you can outsmart the badge. But it always ends the same way." Elijah chuckled under his breath, a soft, hollow sound. "Yeah," he said quietly. "How's it ending tonight, Officer Redding? With a dead federal agent? Or just another black man locked up for breathing wrong?" Kyle's eyes flashed with irritation. He hated being challenged, especially by someone he couldn't break. "Don't push it." He pressed the gun tighter against Elijah's spine. "You don't want me twitching." Elijah stood his ground, voice steady, gaze fixed on the filth-stained tiles ahead of him. "You already twitched, Kyle. That's the problem." And then, like thunder breaking a storm, Valeria Cruz's voice cracked across the station. "Drop the weapon, Redding, now!" She descended the stairs 2 at a time, badge out, weapon drawn but held low, controlled, precise. Her face was tight, eyes blazing, not with fear but fury. Kyle turned halfway, half disbelieving, half defiant. "Who the hell are you?" "Special Agent Valeria Cruz, FBI, she snapped. "You're obstructing a federal operation, assaulting a federal agent, and I've got 3 witnesses upstairs and 10 cameras watching you do it." Kyle's eyes darted to the faces around him. Phones still raised, people still watching. For the first time, his confidence faltered. His breathing sharpened, his grip on the gun loosened, but he didn't lower it entirely. "He said he was FBI, but I didn't see proof," Kyle muttered, justifying himself to no one in particular. "You didn't want to see," Cruz shot back. "You saw a black man with tech on him, and your brain filled in the rest." For a moment, the entire platform seemed to hold its breath. Valeria stepped closer, voice low but slicing. "You're done, Redding. Uncuff him, or I'll do it myself and book you on federal charges. Your call." Kyle hesitated, eyes flicking between her, the badge, the witnesses, and the cold knot of realization forming in his gut. He'd overplayed his hand, and the world was watching. The badge that had made him feel invincible now felt paper thin under scrutiny. He muttered a curse under his breath and yanked a small knife from his pocket. Not a threat, but to cut the flex cuffs. Plastic snapped, and Elijah's hands dropped free. Circulation returning in painful pulses. Elijah turned slowly, face to face with Kyle now, both men breathing hard but for very different reasons. "You just let Santoro walk," Elijah said, "because you couldn't see past this." He tapped his own chest, his skin. "And now, you'll still be the one writing the report, safe behind your desk while we clean up your mess." Kyle opened his mouth to respond, to defend, but the words died before they formed. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't be replayed 100,000 times on a dozen shaky cell phone videos by morning. Valeria wasn't done. "You're suspended," she snapped. "You'll answer to your department, but I'll be filing my own report with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Pray it stops there." Kyle swallowed hard, the taste of whiskey and fear mixing on his tongue. Without another word, he stepped back, lowering his gun, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Cruz turned to Elijah. "Are you good to move?" Elijah nodded, shaking out his hands, feeling the sting in his wrists. His pride was bruised, his mission wrecked, but his purpose burned hotter. "Santoro's gone," he said, voice low, "but not far. He won't risk street level. He's underground somewhere." Valeria tapped her comms. "Patch me into local surveillance. Get eyes on the southern maintenance tunnel. We still have a shot." As Elijah gathered himself, he glanced once more at Kyle, who stood off to the side, alone, stripped of his certainty, his bravado bleeding into the cracks of the station floor. Elijah didn't need to say more. The shame hung thick enough already. And as they moved out, the teenager with the skateboard lowered his phone, still recording until the figures disappeared into the station's dark veins. By morning, the footage would circle the globe. By nightfall, the hunt would continue. And deep down, beneath every headline and every hashtag that would follow, one truth remained. Providence had let its prejudice pull the trigger, but this time it had missed. The moment Officer Kyle Redding cut the flex cuffs off Elijah Barnes, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the station itself was bracing for the aftershock of stupidity. The low hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to dim further, the shadows stretching longer than they should. Valeria Cruz stood nearby, breathing heavy, her sidearm drawn but angled low, her eyes locked on Kyle with a fury she rarely let surface. She wanted to cuff him right then, drag him into federal custody for obstruction, but time wasn't on their side, not anymore. Elijah shook the pain out of his wrists, the sting of circulation returning harsh and fast, his mind already back on the target. "Santoro's on the move," he muttered to Cruz. "He went south through the maintenance tunnels. If we don't lock it down now, he's gone for good." But even as they plotted their next step, fate chose its own path. A sharp whistle sliced through the station, the kind that didn't belong to a train or a commuter. A piercing, deliberate signal. Elijah's eyes snapped toward the far end of the platform, where a heavy-set man in a gray parka stepped into view, hand raised high. Not a commuter, not an innocent. His hand held something cold, compact, metallic, a sidearm. In a split second, everything made sense. Santoro wasn't fleeing alone, he had backup. And that backup had just seen enough to know the operation was compromised. "Gun!" Elijah shouted, but the word had barely left his lips when the first shot rang out. A single crack, loud and sharp, concrete chips sprayed from the column near Valeria's head. She ducked instinctively, weapon snapping upward. Kyle froze, wide-eyed, the reality of live rounds firing in his direction too much for his pride-swollen mind to process. Then chaos exploded. The man in the parka fired again, his aim erratic but purposeful. One shot after another booming in the cavernous station. Passengers screamed, scattering in every direction. A woman dropped her shopping bag, apples rolling like marbles across the tile. A father grabbed his daughter and dove behind a bench. And Kyle? Kyle reacted, but not like a trained cop. He panicked. His gun, still raised from his confrontation with Elijah, swung wildly. No plan, no aim, no control. Just blind, sloppy reflex. He fired. 3 shots. No warning, no assessment, just fear wrapped in authority. The second shot found no target. The third? It found a man's chest. A middle-aged commuter, gray hair, navy blazer, holding a coffee and his phone, was struck clean in the sternum. His eyes went wide, the shock as instant as the blood that spread across his shirt. He collapsed where he stood, the coffee cup bouncing and rolling, spilling everywhere like a mockery of the real spill pooling beneath him. Elijah's eyes widened in horror. "God damn it," he shouted. "You hit a civilian." Valeria spun, eyes scanning, seeing the man go down, his face frozen between confusion and pain. "Shit," she cursed, returning fire now, controlled bursts at the shooter in the parka who ducked behind a support pillar. The station was pure bedlam. Screams echoed down the tunnels, footsteps slapped against concrete, and every shadow looked like it might be holding another gun. Kyle stood frozen, gun still raised, the barrel trembling. I saw, Kyle stammered, but his voice crumbled under the weight of what he'd done. Valeria's face contorted, not just with anger, but something deeper, contempt. "You stupid son of a bitch," she roared over the gunfire. "You just killed an innocent man." But Kyle couldn't hear her, not really. He was somewhere else now, somewhere deep in his own mind, where every rule book and protocol he'd ever skimmed blurred into static. He'd fired, without a target, without a line of sight, without a command. And now a man lay dying because of it. Another shot cracked overhead, this time from a second shooter, appearing at the opposite end of the platform. Santoro's men covering the boss's retreat. Elijah grabbed Kyle by the collar, shaking him hard. "Move, goddammit, move or get people killed." That seemed to snap something loose in Kyle's brain. He stumbled forward, taking cover behind a support beam, panting like he'd just sprinted a mile. Valeria slid next to Elijah, eyes burning. "You okay?" "Fine," Elijah muttered, peering past the pillar, watching for muzzle flashes. "We can't let them get out. There's a service tunnel behind track 4. They'll vanish in that maze." Valeria cursed under her breath, firing another controlled pair of shots, forcing the shooter in the parka back into cover. But her rage wasn't reserved for the enemy. She glanced at Kyle, who crouched nearby, still shaking, still holding his gun like it was foreign to him. "You didn't just ruin the op, Redding," she hissed. "You ruined someone's life. You killed a man because your pride couldn't handle being wrong." Kyle's mouth opened, some pathetic protest forming, but no sound came. He just stared at the man sprawled across the platform, the blood spreading wider with every second. Elijah pushed forward, keeping low, advancing toward track 4, knowing that every tick of the clock meant Santoro was further and further beyond their grasp. Valeria provided cover, firing when she saw movement. The enemy returned fire, but it was scattered, covering, not precise. They weren't here for a shootout, they were here to disappear. And it was working. "We need the exit sealed," Valeria called into her comms. "South tunnels, block them before we lose these bastards." But the comms crackled back with static. Jammed. Someone on Santoro's crew was running interference, scrambling signals just long enough to make escape possible. Valeria ground her teeth, squeezing off another shot that sparked against the concrete, useless. In the distance, a final whistle, a signal to retreat. The shooters withdrew, footsteps slapping into the tunnels, vanishing into dark. Elijah stood near the entrance to the south tunnel, heart racing, gun raised. But it was too late. They were gone. Valeria caught up, breathing heavy. "We lost them," Elijah said, voice low and bitter. "Because of him." He jerked his thumb backward toward where Kyle still crouched, eyes vacant. Valeria didn't argue. She looked back toward the platform, to the man lying still. No medics yet. No hope. The blood had stopped pooling, not because it was contained, but because the heart had stopped. One shot. One life gone. And all because of ego. Valeria turned back to Elijah, her voice low, seething. "This is on Redding, and I'll make sure he answers for it." The echoes of gunfire still hung in the air, refusing to settle even as the shooters vanished into the maze of tunnels. It was like the station itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would pay the price of the last bullet fired. But the price had already been paid. The man in the navy blazer, the one who'd just been waiting to get home, lay sprawled on the cold concrete, eyes wide but seeing nothing. A trickle of blood, almost lazy in its pace, slipped from his lips and down his chin. His coffee cup had rolled to a stop against the far wall, leaking what little remained of its contents in a slow drip, a grotesque echo of the life draining from its owner. Kyle Redding stared at the body, his mouth slightly ajar, his chest heaving but empty of breath. The color in his face had drained, leaving behind something pale and sickly, a man who had pulled a trigger before his brain had caught up with his hands. For all his bravado, his ego, his righteous anger just moments ago, now he looked like a kid who'd smashed something precious and couldn't figure out how to piece it back together. Valeria Cruz didn't care. She stormed toward him, gun still in hand but pointed down, her boots heavy with each step. She stopped just short of him, towering despite her smaller frame. "Look at him," she barked, pointing to the dead man. "Look at what you did." Kyle's eyes flicked to the body, then away, as if glancing too long would make the scene permanent. But it already was. He would see that face every time he closed his eyes for the rest of his life. I thought, Kyle started, but Valeria cut him off. "You thought what? That firing blind into a crowd was smart? That your gut instinct was sharper than the weapon you barely know how to handle?" She laughed bitterly. "You didn't just blow an op, Redding. You killed someone's father, someone's husband. For what? Your pride? Your goddamn ego?" Kyle swallowed hard, his throat dry, but his voice was weak, barely there. "I thought he had a gun." Valeria stepped closer, so close their faces nearly touched. "That man had a cup of coffee. He had a phone, and now he has a morgue slab. That's on you." Nearby, Elijah stood, his breathing still heavy, but his eyes locked on the scene like steel, cold, unyielding. He wanted to be angry, wanted to shout, to shake Kyle until some trace of humanity returned to his dull eyes. But all he felt was exhaustion, bone-deep, soul-heavy exhaustion. This wasn't the first time. And the worst part? He knew it wouldn't be the last. Elijah turned away, scanning the darkness where Santoro had fled. Every second wasted here was a mile of ground Santoro gained. But he couldn't just leave, not yet. Sirens echoed faintly from above. Station security and medics would be swarming soon, too late for the man bleeding out on the floor. Valeria's radio crackled to life again, a scratchy voice piercing the air. "Agent Cruz, security is en route. Medical too, Providence PD notified." She didn't respond right away. She was still staring Kyle down, her eyes two pinpricks of fury. "You'll answer for this," she said, voice low and final. "You think your shield protects you? We'll see how it holds up when the Bureau, the DA, and every goddamn camera phone in this station has your face on replay." Kyle didn't move. He just sank down, collapsing to sit against a pillar, his gun falling from his hand with a clatter. His head fell into his palms. No excuses, no bravado, just the crushing weight of what he'd done. Valeria turned back to Elijah. "We need to move. If we're lucky, we can catch a trace in the tunnel feeds." Elijah nodded, though his body protested with fatigue. "Let's move. I'll take the south entrance. Get a drone team to map the exits." Valeria tapped her comm, coordinating what she could, but even as they prepared to chase the ghost of Santoro, the damage lingered like a stench that wouldn't lift. As they jogged toward the tunnel, Valeria said quietly, almost to herself, "All of this because a white cop couldn't see past a black man standing still." Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. He'd lived that sentence his entire life. They disappeared into the dark, their footsteps fading. Behind them, Kyle still sat on the ground, shaking, the body a few feet away, growing colder by the minute. He could hear the sirens now, louder, closer, but they sounded like they were coming for him. Because in a way, they were. And he knew deep down there wasn't a badge big enough to outrun this. The tunnel swallowed sound as easily as it swallowed light. Elijah Barnes sprinted down the narrow corridor, his lungs burning, every muscle in his body firing on instinct. The air was damp and stale, reeking of mildew, rust, and the faint metallic tang of old blood, like the bones of the city had been rotting just beneath its feet all along. His wrist ached, raw from the plastic flex cuffs. He'd broken free of them minutes ago, the jagged edge of a protruding rebar tearing the plastic just enough for him to yank his hands apart, skin shredding in the process. The sting was sharp, but adrenaline made it distant. He couldn't afford to feel pain right now. Because somewhere ahead of him, Greg Santoro was running. And Elijah couldn't let that bastard disappear. Behind him, barely audible over his own pulse, he'd heard Kyle Redding's voice, pitiful, pleading to be let through, to chase the very suspect he'd helped get away. But Valeria Cruz's voice cut through that noise, sharp and commanding. "You move 1 inch past this line, Redding, I will drop you myself." Elijah couldn't help but grin darkly at the thought, even as he pushed deeper into the pitch-black warren of tunnels. The irony wasn't lost on him. Redding had guns, a badge, authority, but when the city's underbelly demanded grit and courage, he was nothing more than a trembling shadow. Elijah slowed as he entered a fork, two branching paths yawning in front of him like the open jaws of a predator. He stopped, steadied his breath, listened. There, a faint clatter of boots scraping concrete echoing down the left tunnel. Elijah ran. The passage narrowed, overhead pipes dripping cold water that slicked the floor. His sneakers skidded on the grime, but he kept moving, every step fueled by the need to reclaim the mission. Hell, to reclaim his dignity after being humiliated on that platform. Then the sound changed. He wasn't just hearing one set of footsteps anymore. There were two, and one of them had stopped running. Elijah slowed just enough to hear the breath before it lunged at him. Out of the darkness, a shadow struck, low and fast. A solid shoulder slammed into Elijah's midsection, driving him backward into the tunnel wall. His spine cracked against cold stone, the air punched clean out of his chest. His attacker was big, bigger than Elijah, and fast, fists flying in tight, trained arcs. A right hook glanced Elijah's cheekbone, bright sparks firing in his vision, followed by a vicious elbow that cut across his ribs. Elijah absorbed the blows, staying upright, his mind snapping into focus. He'd fought in worse places than this. In Kabul, the alleyways had been narrower. In Mogadishu, the men had carried machetes. This was nothing new. He ducked the next swing, driving his own shoulder into the man's gut, lifting with his legs. The two of them crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and breathless grunts. Elijah rolled on top, throwing a sharp elbow into the man's jaw. The crack echoed sickly, followed by a choked growl. The man bucked him off, but Elijah landed a punch square into his nose, wet and breaking. The attacker reeled back, gasping. Elijah scrambled up, just as the man pulled a knife from his boot, small, curved, wickedly sharp. "You should have stayed cuffed," the man sneered, blood streaming from his nose. Elijah's chest heaved, his hands empty, but that never stopped him before. "And you should have packed more than a butter knife," Elijah shot back, eyes locked. They circled each other, shuffling in the dark like boxers in a ring with no ropes. Then the man lunged. Elijah sidestepped just in time, grabbing the man's knife wrist with both hands. The blade swiped past his ribs, close enough to snag fabric but not flesh. Elijah twisted, using the man's own momentum to slam his back into the tunnel wall. But the guy was strong, too strong to keep pinned with just leverage. He threw an elbow back, catching Elijah's temple. Dazed, Elijah let go just for a second, long enough for the knife to come swinging back, wild and desperate. Elijah ducked, grabbed a broken length of pipe from the floor, and swung upward. The sound of steel meeting skull was thick and final. The man crumpled, his knees folding before his body hit the ground fully. The knife clattered to the side, useless now. Elijah stood over him, panting, the pipe still raised, but the man wasn't getting back up. Not tonight. But Elijah couldn't linger. He could still hear footsteps, one set, retreating deeper. Santoro. Elijah pushed forward, pain blooming in his side where the elbow had landed, his temple throbbing. The tunnel bent sharply, narrowing further, the walls closing in like a throat about to swallow. And then light. Faint, flickering, a sickly yellow glow ahead. Elijah picked up his pace, boots slapping against the damp ground. He emerged into a junction, a maintenance hub long abandoned. Broken lights dangled from wires. A utility ladder stretched up into the dark, and an old drainage gate sat rusted half open. Santoro stood halfway up the ladder, duffel bag slung across his back, pistol in hand. His eyes met Elijah's for a brief, breathless moment. "Persistent bastard, aren't you?" Santoro grunted. Elijah raised his fist, stepping forward. "Persistence what they call me when they can't kill me." Santoro smiled, but there was no humor in it, only weariness, only calculation. Then he fired. Elijah dove sideways, the shot sparking off the concrete wall where his head had just been. He hit the ground, rolled, but didn't stay still. Another shot rang out, missing by inches. By the time Elijah scrambled up again, Santoro was gone, vanished up the ladder, through a hatch Elijah couldn't see. He ran to the base of the ladder, but the hatch had slammed shut, the faint echo of boots on metal growing distant, and then nothing. Gone. Elijah stood there, sweat cold against his skin, chest heaving, not from fear, but from frustration. So damn close. He had nearly had him. But Santoro had slipped through like he always did, another ghost swallowed by the infrastructure of a crumbling city. Behind Elijah, the tunnel was still. His attacker lay motionless, the knife still resting useless nearby. The only sounds now were his own breath and the distant hum of life returning to the station above. Elijah closed his eyes, hand on his ribs, feeling the dull ache of a fight survived but not won. Next time, he whispered to himself. Because there would be a next time. There always was. By the time Elijah climbed out of the tunnels, the world above had already shifted. The once echoing chaos of Lexington Station had given way to flashing red and blue lights. EMTs rushed past with stretchers, police officers cordoned off the platform, and forensic photographers circled the civilian body now zipped into a black bag. News cameras hadn't arrived yet, but the citizen journalists, the ones with phones and live streams, had captured every humiliating, tragic detail. The image was already circulating online. Officer Kyle Redding, guns still drawn, standing over the lifeless commuter he'd shot. Another video caught his earlier confrontation with Elijah, screaming about the recorder, mocking the FBI badge, spitting venom laced with bigotry for all the world to hear. The footage was unflinching, unforgiving. By the time Elijah sat down on a bench, catching his breath, holding his bruised ribs, the hashtags were already trending. Badge but blind. Killed for pride. Valeria Cruz stood nearby, talking rapidly into her comms, orchestrating a salvage operation while a cold fury simmered just beneath her professional tone. She'd made her career on precision, on planning, yet tonight everything had fallen apart because of one cop's ego and prejudice. Kyle wasn't speaking anymore. He sat slumped on the floor near a column, his badge removed, his sidearm confiscated by a stern-faced sergeant who'd arrived from internal affairs. His face was pale, expression vacant, not from shock, but from the slow, sinking realization that the world outside this station would be less forgiving than his department ever had been. Redding, you're suspended indefinitely, the sergeant said bluntly. You'll be contacted by the DA's office, and don't leave town. There was no fight in Kyle now. His career wasn't on life support. It was already dead. And worse, the city had seen his face. The videos didn't just show a tragic mistake. They showed a pattern, a mindset. By the time the night ended, public outrage had already ignited. News anchors debated his record. Protest groups called for his arrest, not just his badge. Civil rights attorneys gathered clips for lawsuits. Elijah watched all of it unfold, his body aching, but his mind sharper than ever. They had lost Santoro, lost a civilian, lost the public's trust in one fell swoop. Valeria approached him, her voice tight with exhaustion. We'll regroup. This isn't over, she promised. Elijah nodded, wiping sweat and grime from his brow. His ribs screamed with every breath, but his conviction held steady. We'll get Santoro, but Redding, Elijah said quietly. He'll have to answer for more than a lost op. He'll have to answer for a life. And with that, the FBI began to reset. The mission wasn't dead, but the stains of that night would never wash away. 3 days later, the hospital room was still dim, the blinds half closed against the afternoon sun. The TV mounted on the wall played news segments Elijah had stopped paying attention to, talking heads dissecting body cam footage, civilians' videos, and the social media wildfire that had made Kyle Redding's name infamous. Elijah Barnes sat propped against the bed's stiff pillows, his side heavily bandaged, his ribs still aching with every breath. He should have been resting, but rest felt foreign. His mind stayed on the tunnels, on Santoro slipping away, on the dead man's face burned into his memory. Then the knock came, a soft, uncertain rap against the doorframe. Elijah turned his head, and there he stood, Kyle Redding. No uniform, no badge, just a man, shoulders slumped, under a jacket 2 sizes too big, like he'd deflated. His face was drawn, sleep-deprived, eyes rimmed with something between guilt and shame. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elijah just watched him, unblinking. Kyle finally stood up inside, his hands stuffed in his pockets like he was trying to keep himself from shaking. He stopped a few feet from the bed, head slightly bowed. "I didn't come here to make excuses," Kyle muttered. I needed to say it to your face." Elijah didn't move, didn't respond, just waited. Kyle swallowed hard, like the words themselves were stuck in his throat. "I saw your skin before I saw your badge." His voice was thin, brittle. "That's the truth. That was my mistake. My blindness." He laughed bitterly under his breath. "I thought I knew what a threat looked like. I thought I was trained to see the difference. But all I saw was a black man standing still with a device, and that was enough for me to jump." The confession hung heavy in the air, raw and ugly. Elijah's eyes stayed locked on Kyle, unflinching. Then quietly Elijah spoke. "And because of that," he asked, voice low, "a man is dead. Not you, not me. Him." Kyle closed his eyes briefly, his shoulders tightening under invisible weight. "I know. Do you?" Elijah pressed, his tone cutting sharper. "Because that face, that blood, that's with you now, forever. That doesn't wash off in a hearing or with a pension." Kyle nodded, slow and heavy. "I'll remember," he said. "I'll remember every day." Silence stretched between them. But it wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't reconciliation. It was a verdict. Kyle didn't ask for redemption, he knew better. He simply turned and left, each step heavier than the last, the echo of his guilt following him out of the room. And Elijah, he laid back slowly, his ribs aching, but not as much as the truth. Some lessons come too late, and some costs can't be paid back. It was just after dawn when the alert came through, an encrypted ping that landed first on Valeria Cruz's secured tablet, flashing with urgency. She stood in the FBI field office, her eyes scanning the data pouring in. Greg Santoro, the ghost they'd almost caught, had resurfaced. According to intel from a border surveillance task force, Santoro had been spotted just outside Plattsburgh, New York, a stone's throw from the Canadian border. He wasn't alone. A convoy of black SUVs, plates scrubbed clean, had been traced traveling north, weaving through back roads. The chatter intercepted hinted at something big, a weapons exchange, one with international implications. A Canadian cartel known for laundering weapons through forested border crossings was the buyer. If Santoro completed this trade, the firepower flooding back into the States would arm extremists, traffickers, and worse. This was their shot, their last shot. Valeria tapped the comms, her voice steady but sharp. "Mobilize the team. I want eyes on that border route in the next 3 hours. Drones, unmarked units, everything." Across the room, Elijah Barnes sat in a chair, his ribs still wrapped in stiff bandages, his side tender with every breath. But his eyes, sharp, alive, ready. He looked up from the tablet where maps of the border flickered in real time. "Tell me you're bringing people who can shoot straight this time," Elijah muttered, half a grin on his lips. Valeria smirked back, but the fire in her gaze didn't waver. "Only Bureau, no locals unless I personally vet them." They'd both agreed on that. After the disaster at Lexington Station, they weren't risking interference. Not from overzealous beat cops, not from anyone looking to help with more ego than skill. The last thing they needed was another Kyle Redding blundering in with a gun and a bias. Elijah stood carefully, wincing slightly but shaking it off. "Santoro's not running just to run," he said. "If he's meeting the cartel, it's because the price just went up. He knows he's hot. He won't make this easy." Valeria nodded, pulling up drone surveillance, already tracking the convoy's last known position. "We're not just tracking Santoro, we're tracking the buyers too. If we let him cross that border, we'll be buried in jurisdictional bullshit from here to Ottawa." Elijah chuckled dryly. "Yeah, and I'm not in the mood to play politics with Mounties." Valeria's expression softened for just a beat, then steeled again. "This time we finish it. We do it clean. We do it right." Elijah's eyes darkened, thoughtful. "Let's just hope the next uniform we see doesn't pull a Redding." Valeria shot him a knowing look. "I'll shoot first if they do." They both laughed, but it was a tired laugh, because underneath the banter, they both knew the truth. The job wasn't just hunting the Santoros of the world. It was navigating the ignorance embedded within the very system that was supposed to help them. A soft buzz vibrated on the table, the full tactical team confirming readiness. Black SUVs, surveillance vans, all heading out. The hunt was alive again. As Elijah slipped on his jacket, still stiff from the bruises underneath, he paused by the window. The sunrise stretched across the skyline, but it felt colder somehow, grayer. Valeria noticed. She stepped up beside him. "You all right?" Elijah stared at the horizon for a beat longer before replying. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" He turned to her, his voice low, steady, but heavy with weight. "Facing criminals is one thing. That part, you expect the danger, but it's the other fight that wears on you." "What fight?" Elijah held her gaze. "Fighting the ignorance in your own ranks." He shook his head slowly. "The ones who carry badges carry guns, but don't carry sense." Valeria didn't reply right away. There was nothing to say. She just nodded because she understood deeply. "Then we keep fighting both," she said finally. "Because if we don't, who will?" Elijah smiled faintly, the kind of smile that knows the road ahead is longer than anyone wants to admit. "Yeah," he murmured, "let's finish this." They grabbed their gear, their mission clear. Santoro was close, but every step forward wasn't just a step toward a criminal. It was another round in the endless battle against a system that too often mistook prejudice for protection. And as Elijah followed Valeria out the door, into the cold morning, into the chase, one thought settled in his bones. Facing criminals is exhausting, but it's nothing compared to fighting ignorance in your own ranks. And the sun kept rising because the fight was never over. And maybe that's the real lesson behind all of this. It's not just a story about chasing criminals through tunnels or across borders. It's about the deeper, quieter fight, the one that happens inside the very institutions we trust to protect us. Because sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one holding a weapon. It's the one holding a badge with a closed mind and an open trigger finger. For many of us watching from the sidelines, it's easy to think these moments are isolated. Just one bad cop or a misunderstanding. But as we've seen, it only takes one moment of bias, 1 second of misjudgment, for lives to be changed forever. A man lost his life on that subway platform, not because of a criminal, but because of a uniform worn by someone who couldn't see past a person's skin. For those of us who have lived long enough to see patterns repeat, this truth hits hard. We've seen generations wrestle with prejudice disguised as protocol, ego disguised as enforcement. And still, here we are. That's why stories like Elijah Barnes aren't just entertainment. They're mirrors. They reflect back at us the question we all must answer. How much longer will we tolerate ignorance parading as authority? But the story also reminds us of resilience. People like Elijah and Valeria don't give up. Not on the mission, not on justice, and not on holding their own institutions accountable. It's a painful road, but necessary, because if good people stop pushing back, nothing changes. So if this story made you think, if it stirred something in you, whether it was frustration, sadness, or a quiet sense of hope, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what lessons you see in this. And if you want more stories that pull back the curtain on justice, bias, and the fight to make things right, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter. Because out there, these battles aren't fiction, and the more we talk about them, the harder they are to ignore.